Thank you for joining me. Coming up on the show, lots of news and safety tips, including a deadly crash in Teterboro, New Jersey, and what we know about it so far. A huge high-tech airship that's under development in Silicon Valley. And one celebrity is donating his jet, another is selling his jet that's sat unused for 35 years, and a third one announces he'll be filming a sequel to everyone's favorite jet movie. Plus, what you should know about Magnetos, how they work, and how they can save your life if you know what to look for when you're doing a mag check. Plus, lots of listener mail. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author, and 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year to bring you news and safety tips to help you fly safely. Now, just a quick reminder, the 2017 listener survey is live, and I'd love to hear from you about what you like about the podcast and how we might be able to improve it. I want to thank those who have already taken it, but if you haven't filled it in, please go to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Or you can get to it by clicking a link in the show notes. I'll plan to keep the survey open through the end of June. Remember, aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Oh, and here's how you can help right now. If you enjoy the show, please tell all of your friends. All this and more, and the news starts now. We're going to start off with a sad story about a crash. Usually we don't talk about crashes unless there's something that we can learn from it. And this one is kind of interesting. From the Washington Post, a Learjet approached New Jersey's Teterboro Airport, making a later than usual turn toward the runway before it banked hard and crashed into an industrial area, killing the 2 crewmen aboard, federal investigators said last week. The NTSB issued a preliminary report into the May 15th crash of the twin-engine Learjet 35, which was headed to Teterboro from Philadelphia International Airport. Radar data indicated the aircraft did not start its right circling turn until it was less than a mile, or 1.6 kilometers, from the approach end of the runway, the NTSB said. Controllers said aircraft typically start that turn about 4 miles or 6 kilometers away. A controller reported that he observed the aircraft bank hard to the right, and he could see the belly of the airplane with the wings almost perpendicular to the ground. The airplane then appeared to level out for just a second or two before the left wing dropped, showing the entire top of the airplane. Other ground witnesses also reported they observed the airplane in a right turn with the wings in a high angle of bank. The jet crashed among small warehouses and industrial buildings about a quarter mile from the runway. There were no passengers aboard and no one on ground was injured. Surveillance video showed the moment of impact and then a huge fireball. The NTSB said at the time of the crash, the wind speed was 23 miles an hour with gusts to nearly 35 miles per hour. Well, it sounds like they overshot to final as they were making their turn. Now, that's really easy to do if you have a tailwind on base because you're going to be going faster than you're used to. Now, I looked up the Learjet 35, and the VREF speed on final is going to be anywhere from 115 knots up to 129 knots at maximum landing weight. And if you're going even faster than that because you have a tailwind, well, your turn radius is going to get larger, and so you're going to have to start that turn even earlier. So if these people started the turn late to begin with, and maybe they had a tailwind, and of course they had to fly fast because they were a Learjet, it's going to be easy to overshoot the final. And it sounds like they may have done that and then steepen up the bank to try and roll out on the center line. If the wing dropped, it does sound like the aircraft stalled. So anyway, anytime you're turning to final and it's not working out well, just go around. Some landings are not worth trying to save. From AvWeb, a high-tech airship is under construction in a Silicon Valley hangar, according to a recent report in The Guardian, and it will likely be more than 650 feet from nose to tail. It's going to be massive on a grand scale, one source told the paper, though that would still be smaller than the classic airships of the early 1900s. The Hindenburg, for example, stretched more than 800 feet long. The new project, reportedly financed by Google co-founder Sergey Brin, is being worked on in a former airship hangar at Moffett Field, which has been leased by Planetary Ventures, a Google-controlled company, since 2014. Brin has not released nor confirmed any information about the project. Brin is reportedly interested in developing the airship both to deliver aid relief to remote areas and to provide a luxury mode of travel, according to The Guardian. From our How Dumb Can You Be department, this comes from aeronews.net. A Virginia man pleads guilty selling parts from the Marine One Squadron. Well, a staff sergeant at the Marine base Quantico has pleaded guilty to stealing night vision equipment from the Marine One helicopter squadron, which of course is used by the president, and selling it on the online auction site eBay. According to the plea bargain, 34-year-old Brendan Baker stole at least 51 image intensifier tubes and other night vision parts worth about $94,000 from the department. Baker sold the gear on eBay, and it was not reported how much he actually received from the stolen property. They said that he was a naval technician starting in 2003 after being promoted to calibration technician, eventually rising to the position of repair lab supervisor. He'll be sentenced in August on charges of theft of government property. The maximum penalty is 10 years in prison. And the first of our 3 celebrity stories comes from AvWeb. John Travolta is donating his personal Boeing 707 to an Australian museum, which will restore it. Travolta said he plans to personally deliver the Boeing to Historic Aircraft Restoration Society in Illawarra, New South Wales, Australia, after some maintenance is done on the aircraft. Travolta bought the old airliner in 1998, a few years after he chartered it for a fast trip to Europe. It was originally delivered to Qantas in 1964. It was outfitted with the executive interior in 1973 and had previously been owned by Frank Sinatra. According to Travolta, even a movie star can't justify the maintenance cost on the thirsty jet. Any plane of this size is too pricey. But let's not feel too sorry for him. He still owns a Gulfstream G2, an Eclipse, a Yugoslav Soko fighter, and a couple of ultralights. And just on a personal note, I saw Travolta take off in his 707 at Oshkosh, probably in 2011 or 2012. It was a takeoff at night. Midway through the takeoff roll, there was a huge bang, and that was a compressor stall. Now, the 707s, I think, were a little bit more susceptible to compressor stalls, especially with, as I recall, a quartering tailwind. So anyway, the aircraft stopped. It taxied all the way back, and a couple minutes later did another takeoff, which was successful. And from the Washington Post, this celebrity just sold his jet, but he's probably not going to really be missing it. A private jet once owned by Elvis Presley has been auctioned off after sitting on a runway in New Mexico for 35 years. The plane sold for $430,000 on Saturday at a California event featuring celebrity memorabilia. The buyer was not disclosed. The auction house said Elvis has designed the interior that has gold-tone woodwork, red velvet seats, and red shag carpet. But the red 1962 Lockheed Jetstar has no engine and needs a restoration of its cockpit. It's been privately owned for 35 years and sitting on the tarmac in Roswell, New Mexico. And finally, from aeronews.net. Great Balls of Fire, everyone's favorite jet movie, is coming back to the big screen. After some 30 years in development, a sequel to the movie Top Gun is set to begin shooting probably sometime next year. That was the bombshell dropped on the host of the Australian morning television program Sunrise last week, according to a report from Mashable. The Sunrise crew tweeted, "Tom Cruise just confirmed that Top Gun 2 is happening. I'm going to start filming in probably the next year," he said. The movie was just gaining traction in 2012 when the director unfortunately committed suicide, which ended the project for the time. They've since hired a screenwriter and a production company. Sundance has come on board. But Cruise has a busy schedule, including Mission Impossible 6 being filmed now and scheduled for release next summer. But Top Gun 2 is next on his list, according to the report. It may be in theaters sometime in 2020 or 2021. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we talk about magnetos, how they work, and how they can prevent you from getting killed by a hot prop, plus listener letters. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before we talk about magnetos and hot props, first a couple announcements. I'm headed out to Kansas this week to help a new owner bring his brand new SR20. Well, actually, it's new to him. It's a used SR20 from Kansas to his home in Albany, New York. And then next week, I'm headed out to Denver to move a plane, an SR-22 to Salt Lake City. And I'll finish up the week in Williamsport teaching in a week-long clinic for Cirrus pilots. But yesterday in Livermore, California, while flying in the traffic pattern with a student pilot, we had a whole lot of fun company on the parallel runway. We had a B-17 land twice while we were there. A B-24 landed on 25 right as we were holding short of 25 left. And finally, as we were on approach to 25 left, a P-51 did a low flyby on the right runway. Of course, he was a little bit faster than us, but that was great fun to be in the pattern with all these vintage warbirds. And then finally, Basic Med. I've got a show coming up on that. If you have any experiences you'd like to share, good or bad, questions you might have, please send them to me via email. Go to aviationnewstalk.com/contact, or just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact and send me an email. Well, this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about 3 ways you can support the show. You probably know the best way to do it. Just tell your friends about the show. The next way you can support it, go out to iTunes, leave a review. You can do that through the Apple Podcast app. And the third way, if you don't want to find yourself up there in the air wondering which buttons to push, sign up for one or more of my online courses at pilotlearning.com. We have courses for the G1000, both for VFR and IFR, and there's a GPS and WAAS course for those of you flying the latest fancy GPS approaches using WAAS, flying LPV, LNAV plus V, and so on, whether it's with your Garmin 430s or G1000s, you name it, we talk about it. Courses range from $59 to $79. You can take all the courses if you want for a low monthly membership of $29.95, or sign up for the entire year for $299, which is the same as getting 2 months free. And if you do sign up for the full year, you'll get a 1/2-hour consulting call with me on any topic you like to discuss. Okay, let's talk about hot props and how moving a propeller could result in serious injury or even death. I had never seen a video of a propeller starting accidentally until I was researching this segment, and I found one, so I put a link to it in the show notes. You'll see that the pilot was shocked when the engine started and that he barely escaped serious injury. We're also going to talk about magnetos, because these are the culprits that can lead to a hot prop. And we'll talk about the mag check that most pilots do during their run-up before takeoff, and how to use it to make sure that you don't have a hot prop. Now first, there are 2 meanings to the phrase hot prop. One, which is very common, is that the propeller has the capability of being heated to prevent ice formation on the propeller. Now that's not the one we're talking about today. The other meaning of hot prop is that because of a failure of one of the safety systems in your airplane, your prop is like a loaded gun. If you move it by hand even a small amount, it could start and run for a couple of seconds, which is just enough time to seriously injure or kill you. I wanted to talk about this because I've run into many experienced pilots who are just not aware of how to determine if they have a hot prop, or of safe ways to move a propeller by hand. Now this is not hard stuff, and just knowing 1 or 2 small things about the magnetos and the propeller could save your life. So I want to implore you to listen to the next few minutes, remember what we talk about, and please share this information with all of your pilot friends. So let's first talk about why a prop can be hot and how that could kill you. For the propeller to turn, 2 things have to happen. There has to be some small amount of fuel left in the engine, and a spark has to reach the spark plugs. Now, under normal conditions, the mag switch, which is the one you put the key in, will prevent any spark from reaching the spark plugs when it's in the off position. However, if there's a loose connection to the switch, or the switch is becoming old and intermittent, the spark can still reach the spark plug even when you have the key in the off position. Therefore, it becomes critical that you always shut down the engine correctly so that there is no residual fuel left in the engine. That way, even if your mag switch is not operating properly in the off position and spark is making it to the spark plugs, the engine still won't start when you move the propeller. So let's first talk about shutting down the engine properly, as that is one of 2 things you can do to assure that your propeller never accidentally fires when you turn it. The other thing that you can do is that when you turn the propeller by hand, perhaps so that you can attach the tow bar to move the airplane, only turn it in the opposite direction from which it normally turns. That is the only safe direction to turn a propeller. Now, when you shut down an engine, generally as part of the process, you will pull the mixture all the way back to the idle cutoff position, which starves the engine of fuel. After the propeller comes to a stop, and only after it comes to a complete stop, you will turn the key in the mag switch to the off position. Doing this correctly should assure that there's no unburned fuel left in the engine. However, I see some pilots just rush through this process, and unknowingly they're leaving unburned fuel in the engine, which is one of the 2 things we need for a hot prop. So the reason it's important that you wait for the prop to stop before you turn off the mag switch is that while the mag switch is still on, the engine will continue to burn all residual fuel. However, If you turn the key off while the prop is still turning, you've just removed the spark, so the engine can no longer burn the residual fuel. So by rushing to turn the key off before the prop stops, you have just loaded your engine with fuel. You have left fuel in the engine, and now all it needs for you is to move the prop slightly, which can cause a spark that can cause the engine to start by itself for 2 or 3 seconds, which of course is just long enough to kill you. I mentioned that there are 2 things you can do to assure your prop doesn't fire accidentally when you turn it. One is to shut down the engine properly by waiting until the prop has stopped before turning off the mag key. The other, which I mentioned briefly before, is when you turn a propeller, turn it in the opposite direction from which it normally turns. Now, when you do that, the magneto cannot send a spark to the spark plugs, so even if there is some residual fuel in the engine, a spark cannot be generated. Now, I'm sure there are some of you listening right now who are thinking, but I've always heard you should never turn a prop in the opposite direction. The reason you may have heard people say that is that it is possible that turning the prop in the opposite direction might shorten the life of the carbon vein that connects the vacuum pump to the engine. I don't know if that has been proven to be true, but even if it has, what is the value of your life compared to potentially having to replace the vacuum pump on your aircraft a few hours sooner than it would have had to been replaced anyway? You can always get a new vacuum pump. But if you're killed by a hot prop, as some people have been, you can't get your life back. So my advice is, when you move a propeller, move it in the opposite direction of normal rotation. Now, here's an easy way to remember that. When you are sitting in the pilot's seat looking out the window, the propeller turns clockwise when the engine is running. Therefore, when you are standing in front of the propeller and looking at it from the opposite direction, turn it clockwise from your view, which will be the opposite direction that it was turning when you viewed it from the pilot's seat. To understand why it's important to turn the propeller backwards and why moving the propeller in its normal direction of travel can generate a spark, it's important to understand how the magnetos work. So let's talk first about what is a magneto and how it works. Most piston aircraft have magnetos unless they have electronic ignition, which is still relatively rare. Now, the only 2 planes that I've flown with electronic ignition are the twin Diamond DA-42 and the jet fuel version of the Diamond DA-40, which is called the DA-40NG. With those aircraft, you should always consider the prop to be hot, as the props on these jet fuel-powered aircraft are even more likely to start accidentally when you touch them than aircraft with magnetos. And that's true even if you follow all the safety procedures. So be very careful with these aircraft. But back to magnetos and most normal piston aircraft. The magnetos are the devices which are connected to the engine that, when turned, generate a spark which goes to the spark plugs. By the way, they generate a spark regardless of whether the engine is running and turning the magnetos, or whether you are turning the prop by hand, which also turns the magnetos. Magnetos are these days mainly used on engines where there is no other available electrical power, such as lawnmowers or chainsaws, but oddly, they're widely used on aviation piston aircraft because of their reliability. That's because if you were to have a complete electrical failure in your airplane, as long as the engine is turning, those magnetos will still generate a spark and the engine will still keep working. When the magneto is turned, you're turning a permanent magnet that rotates within 2 coils inside the magneto, and that generates a current flow within those coils. Now, one coil is connected to a capacitor and a set of points that are normally closed, but which regularly open and close to interrupt current flow within that coil. Now, when the points open, the current stops flowing and the magnetic field collapses quickly, and that induces a sudden increase in current in the other coil, which causes one of the spark plugs to fire. Most engines have 2 spark plugs in each cylinder. So if you have a 4-cylinder engine, for example, you're going to have a total of 8 spark plugs. And each plane will have 2 magnetos, one which sequentially fires half of the spark plugs located in each of the 4 cylinders, and another magneto that fires the other 4 spark plugs in sequence within the 4 cylinders. In normal operation, both magnetos are operating and all 8 spark plugs fire at various times within the 4 cylinders. And having 2 spark plugs in each cylinder provides some redundancy in case one of the spark plugs in the cylinder is not working. If both spark plugs in the cylinder are working, one plug fires a little bit before the other one, which results in a more even burning of the fuel throughout the cylinder, which leads to lower temperatures. If only one spark plug is working in a cylinder, it takes a little longer for that single spark plug to burn all of the fuel in the cylinder, which results in a higher temperature. Knowing this gives you one more thing you can look for when you're doing a mag check during a run-up. So let's talk about some of the details of doing a proper mag check that you may not be aware of. For sure, you know that when you turn the key from the both position to either the L or the R position, that you are looking for a drop in the RPM. This occurs because you have just turned off half the spark plugs, and the engine is putting out slightly less power. And you probably know that the RPM drop should not exceed the amount specified in your checklist, and that the drop should be about the same for both the L and the R positions. But let's talk about what happens when you turn the key to the L or the R position. In those positions, you are connecting a wire to just one of the magnetos, which shorts the spark from that magneto to ground so that the spark plugs connected to the magneto cannot fire. That wire which does the grounding, well, it's called the P lead, so just the big letter P. So when you switch to the L position, for example, only the spark plugs connected to the left mag will fire because the P lead is grounding the output of the right mag. And when you switch to the R position, only the spark plugs connected to the right mag will fire because the P lead is now grounding the output of the right mag. And you may have already guessed that when the key is in the off position, the output of both magnetos are grounded by the two P leads so that no spark can reach any of the spark plugs. So when you're doing your mag check, here are some things to look for. First, it's absolutely essential that you see some drop in RPM when you turn to the L or R positions. If there is no drop, that means that one of the P leads is either loose or broken. Now, the engine's going to work just fine in this condition. However, you now have a hot prop. So if you see that you don't have any RPM drop on one of the magnetos when you do the mag check, it's essential that you follow your engine shutdown procedure properly so that you don't also leave unburned fuel in the engine. If instead you rush through the process and turn off the key before the prop stops turning, you are now at a very high risk of having the engine start if you move the propeller by hand even a small amount. As you turn the prop by hand, at some point those points are going to open and a spark will be sent to the spark plug. And if there is unburned fuel in the cylinder, that engine will probably start, but for only a couple of seconds. However, those few seconds could totally change your life or even kill you. Now, having a loose or broken P lead is rare, but occurs more often than you might think. Just in this past year, I have found 2 aircraft with P lead problems. One was a used aircraft that had just gone through a thorough pre-purchase inspection. The new owner and I were traveling to Richmond, Virginia to bring the plane back to California. And we did the very first mag check during the run-up. I noticed there was no RPM drop at all for one of the key positions, one of the magnetos. I was surprised that this was not detected during the pre-purchase inspection, but it really confirms for me that pilots and mechanics look for different things when they're working on an airplane. The second aircraft I saw with a P lead problem had a very different behavior. Sometimes when we did a mag check, everything was fine, but I noticed that occasionally the RPM would not drop when we checked one of the magnetos. It's possible that the P lead was loose and only worked some of the time, but I also think it's possible that the mag switch was getting old and its contacts were slightly corroded. Regardless, we squawked the problem for maintenance to fix, and I didn't hear which of those possibilities was actually causing the problem. Here are a couple of other recommendations for when you do your mag check. I was always taught to first turn the mag key 2 clicks to the left, look for the RPM drop, and then turn the key back to the both position to make sure that the RPM went back up, and then turn the key 1 click to the left to check the other mag before turning it back to the both position. Now, you might think that it doesn't matter whether you first check the magneto that's 2 clicks away or the magneto that's 1 click away, but there is a reason why it makes sense to turn to the 2 clicks position first. And I never knew why I should do 2 clicks first until I started seeing pilots make a very simple mistake during the mag check. The first time a pilot made the mistake, I didn't catch it, and we took off on one mag, resulting in less power and higher temperatures. But the second time it happened with another pilot, I caught the mistake before we took off. Now, here's the problem. When you turn the key 1 click away to check one of the magnetos, you will always turn the key back 1 click to get back to the both position. However, what I have discovered is that sometimes pilots make a mistake when they check the magneto that is 2 clicks away, and they only turn the key back 1 click when they are attempting to return to the both position. That leaves the aircraft operating on just a single magneto. Now, if the last thing you check is the magneto that's 2 clicks away, and you only turn the key back 1 click, there's a high probability that you will take off on just one magneto. However, if the last thing you check is the magneto that is 1 click away, it's almost impossible to miss the both position when you turn the key back to the right. Therefore, you should first check the magneto that is 2 clicks away to minimize the chance of taking off on just one magneto. Many aircraft now have sophisticated engine monitors that show the exhaust gas temperature, or EGT, and cylinder head temperature, or CHT, for each cylinder. If you have one of these engine monitors, when you do the mag check, look at the EGTs when you turn the key to the L and the R positions. All 4 or 6 EGTs should rise in the L or R position, and all of them should fall when you return the key to the both position. Now, if instead the temperature for one of the cylinders falls in the L or R position, you now know that one of the spark plugs is not working in that cylinder. You should note the cylinder number so you can tell the mechanic which cylinder has a spark plug problem. Well, there you have it, a quick tutorial on prop safety. In the future, remember these things when you're operating an aircraft. First, always assume that every prop is hot and be extremely careful when you turn it. Second, when you do a mag check, make sure that you get an RPM drop for both the L and R positions. Otherwise, you do have a hot prop. To minimize the chance of taking off on a single magneto, when you do the mag check, first turn the key 2 clicks to check one of the magnetos so that you minimize the chance of not returning the key to the both position when you're done with the mag check. And finally, when you shut down the engine, don't rush through the process. After you pull the mixture to idle, stop, look outside, watch the propeller, and don't move to the next step, which is to turn the mag key to off, until after the propeller has come to a complete stop. And make sure that you educate your friends about prop safety and the correct way to do a mag check. We want to make sure that all of our pilot friends live to become very old pilots. And coming up next, questions from listeners. One listener wants to know just how much flight instruction can he as a private pilot give to someone else who's a student pilot. We'll be right back. And welcome back. And I've gotten 1 or 2 comments over social media saying, hey, what happened to the show last week? Well, this was last week's show. I started it and I tried to complete it before I left on a trip, and darn, couldn't quite get it done. So I've already come back from Kansas. Great trip. We were able to get from Hutchinson, Kansas to Albany, New York in about 7 hours or so. Great tailwinds the entire way. Averaged about 165 knots in an aircraft, an SR-20 that does maybe 135 to 140. The last part of the trip, when we reached the Pennsylvania border, we were dodging a very weak cold front. So there were little cells scattered around, had no problem finding very large holes among them as we looked at the XM weather radar picture that we had with us. And we're happy to arrive in Albany after a tornado had just passed through a couple hours before. So everything worked out fine. It was a great trip. And I want to thank listener Rick for calling me up and saying, hey, I listened to your podcast. Would you come fly with me in my new airplane that I've just purchased? So we had a great time. Hey, let me tell you a little bit about iTunes. I want to thank the 3 people who posted reviews this past week, and I'm going to just give you some quick excerpts from each of them. Brett C., who flies a Stinson, said in part, I appreciate the pace and focus of the information. No baloney, just good, solid information. Well, thanks, Brett. That's exactly what I've been trying to accomplish with this podcast. FOD Stalker provided a lot of great feedback and suggestions. Here's one that I promise to implement in the future. He said, the hardest few minutes were listening to that twin-engine pilot in distress. I got a little choked up imagining that we were hearing the last words of this pilot. I would have preferred if you'd started the segment with, what you were about to hear is disturbing, but in the end the pilot made it out alive. That would have been appreciated, at least by me. I find it hard but necessary to remind myself all the time that what we do as GA pilots is safe, but potentially deadly. Thank you very much for giving me that feedback. You make an excellent point. I promise to let people know more ahead of time about what's going to happen in any ATC audio clips that I play. And finally, Skydiver Dan wrote in part, I recently started my journey into aviation and was looking for a few podcasts to help me understand what I was getting into. I highly recommend this podcast as one of the best available. Hey, thanks so much for those reviews. I really appreciate it. Now let's go to some listener questions.
Hi, Max. This is Rick. The question today is about learning to fly, specifically for my wife, who's a student pilot and has been training in our Cessna 182. I'm a private pilot studying for my IFR, and there's been a dearth of CFIs in our area. The schools are booked full, and the availability of CFIs to work in owners' planes is hard to come by. And I want to keep up the momentum, and so the question is about how much experience can I help her get, either from my flying in the left seat, or, if legal and practical, maybe me flying from the right seat while she sits in the left. Anyway, get your perspective on this would be important for us to stay safe and legal. I think I'm digging through the FAR AIM to see what's specific. I can't find anything directly, but I've only started looking. If you could help us think about it, we'd appreciate it, and let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Great question. I'm sure there's some listeners right now who are thinking about that themselves, thinking, well, let's see, I've taken my friend up flying with me, and I let him or her fly in the controls for a while, and that seems safe. So, well, this is okay, isn't it? Maybe. But let me step back on your earlier part of the question. You said there are a dearth of CFIs in your area, and I see from another note that you're in the Houston, Texas area. But you know what? That's true pretty much across the country. The last time I saw a shortage of CFIs like this was back around 2000, 2001. And what happened was something similar. The airlines had a massive growth phase. They were trying to hire pilots like crazy, and they were pulling a lot of CFIs out of the teaching ranks and putting them into airliner cockpits. Same thing's happening now, and so it's pretty hard sometimes to find a CFI. You also said that the local CFIs are reluctant to fly in owner aircraft, and I'm guessing that's because they're fully occupied flying in their flight school aircraft. So one possibility you might want to consider is, flight schools are going to want to keep their own airplanes in the sky first. So even though this might not be the most cost-effective thing to do, you might consider having your wife fly with a local CFI in one of the flight school airplanes. That would be one way, I think, to get better access to the CFIs, because obviously the flight school is going to make more money if their CFI is flying in their airplane rather than in your airplane. So that's one thing to consider. So I thought I knew the answer to this question. I had to dig in the FARs a little bit. It took me about 5 minutes, but I did find it. If you go to FAR 61.3, which is requirements for the CFI certificate, it says, and under Section 2, except as provided in paragraph D3 of this section, no person other than the holder of a flight instructor certificate issued under this part with the appropriate ratings on that certificate may give training required to qualify a person for solo flight and solo cross-country flight. So that covers quite a bit of flying that you might consider teaching your wife. All of the things required for solo flight would cover all of the different maneuvers, slow flight, stalls, steep turns, things like that. And most importantly, landings. Solo cross-country flight, obviously that's going to include navigation and things like that. So that really doesn't leave many things that you could legally teach. Some of the things that come to mind would be, for example, when the two of you are flying together, she might operate the radios, or she might operate the VOR, or she might operate the GPS. All of that, I think, would be perfectly fine. As for your flying from the right seat, what I got to tell you is the first few hours for me flying in the right seat, not so bad when I was up in the air, terrifying when I was landing. I don't know what it is, but the view from the right seat is very different from the left seat. So I strongly encourage you not to just kind of hop over in that seat and try it to see what it's like. The safest way to get experience in the right seat would be to bring a flight instructor along so that they can kind of guard the controls and save the day if something didn't work out quite right. I think the most practical area for you to work with your wife would be on some of the ground instruction. So all the FARs, rules and regulations, airspace, weather, weight and balance, all those kinds of things. I think those would be great areas to work together. But I think for the flying part, boy, I really strongly encourage you to find a flight instructor, even if you have to pay for a different aircraft for that flight instructor. And just one final thought, Rick, I know this is not the kind of answer you're probably hoping to hear from me, but I did want to support it with just one other comment. I pulled this from the FAA's Student Pilot Guide, and in the front it says, the quality of instruction and the knowledge and skills you acquire from your flight instructor will affect your entire flying career, whether you plan to pursue it as a vocation or an avocation. So I think it's very important that any student pilot, including your wife, get the best possible instruction first, because the things you learn first are the things you tend to remember most. So I suggest you do whatever it takes to find a really good flight instructor. Remember, they're not going to just be at the flight schools. You can check Craigslist, you can check bulletin boards. A lot of CFIs who are independent and don't work for a flight school will put their card up on a bulletin board at nearby airports. There are lists of flight instructors at the NAFI website, National Association of Flight Instructors. If you do a search on Master CFI list, you can also search for a flight instructor that way. So good luck. I'm sure you'll find somebody who can help you. And here's a letter from Mike, who's a helicopter pilot in Alabama. He says, Max, last week's subject about the recent federal court decision that the FAA has no authority to require drone users to register truly does not sit well with me. I fly helicopters in Northwest Florida, Pensacola, as a military reservist for the Navy Flight School, and in Southeast Alabama for the Army Flight School. I have had several experiences on the Gulf Coast with drones. I have seen people operate drones over the houses at similar altitudes to helicopters flying. I had an experience flying night vision goggles over Destin Beach with someone flying a drone off the roof of a hotel at an altitude of 800 feet AGL while I was flying at 500 AGL. This location is also a mile away from the Destin Airport, KDTS. I believe that the FAA retains the right to require anyone owning a drone to register them. When an aircraft hits one, we will know who is responsible. Thanks for that, Mike. And listener John in Tucson says, Max, a great review on the portable ADS-B receivers. I now have a much clearer understanding of what I am seeing and what I am not seeing. Honestly, I think ADS-B-in has increased my workload and anxiety level when flying my Piper Cherokee. Sometimes it is too much information that keeps my eyes down rather than up. Your review has relieved some of that anxiety, but most importantly, shed light on the inefficiencies of the system. Love the podcast. Thanks so much for that, John. Well, that wraps it up for this show. Please take a moment to give me feedback through the listener survey. And thanks to everyone who's filled out the survey already. I'm getting lots of great comments and feedback from you. You can find it at aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Or if you're using an iPhone or iPad, just click on the logo for this show at the top of your screen, and you'll find a link to the survey. You can also find links where you can record a listener question like the one we just heard, or send me an email. And if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me early in the process so I can help you with that evaluation. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. And if you've enjoyed this show, please tell your friends. And if you really like it, leave a review in the Apple Podcast app or sign up for one of my courses at pilotlearning.com. In the meantime, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And finally, Skydiver Dan wrote in part, I recently started my journal. I can't read this.